The crystal chandeliers of the Pierre Hotel ballroom refracted light into 1,000 tiny rainbows, but none of that beauty reached Cassandra Thornfield's eyes. She stood frozen champagne dripping from her hair down her neck, soaking through the navy silk that stretched tight across her 8-month belly. The cold liquid shocked her skin, but not as much as the silence that followed. 300 of New York's elite mid-conversation, mid-laughter, mid-bite all stopped. Forks hovered. Glasses paused halfway to lips. The string quartet in the corner stumbled through half a measure before trailing into nothing. Her husband, Garrett Sullivan, didn't offer a napkin. He didn't offer an apology. He just stood there, the empty champagne flute still dangling from his fingers, his face twisted with a rage that had been building all evening. A cruel satisfaction flickered across his features, the kind that comes when a man finally stops pretending to be decent. Cassandra's hand moved instinctively to her stomach protective shielding. The baby kicked as if sensing her mother's distress. She forced herself to breathe, to stay upright, to not give him the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Not here, not in front of everyone. 3 years. 3 years of careful deception, and it all came down to this moment. He thought she was nobody, a charity case he'd rescued from obscurity. He had no idea that the 3 black SUVs currently pulling up to the hotel's entrance contained the most dangerous men in Manhattan's financial district, and they were here for her. But that revelation was still minutes away. First, she had to survive the next 60 seconds without collapsing. Cassandra's mind pulled her backward away from the champagne-soaked humiliation, back to where it all began. Back to the moment she decided that disappearing was the only way to breathe. 36 months earlier. The day Cassandra walked out of Thornfield Industries headquarters, she was 24 years old and suffocating. Her father, Henry Thornfield, had been dead for exactly 6 weeks. Massive heart attack at his desk, gone before the paramedics arrived. The funeral had been a circus of board members offering condolences that felt more like job interviews, each one positioning themselves as the logical choice to guide her through her inevitable ascension to CEO. She'd stood at the grave in a black Chanel suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, watching them watch her, calculating her worth not in grief but in stock options and quarterly projections. Nathaniel, her eldest brother, had squeezed her shoulder once, a silent acknowledgement that they were both drowning in expectations neither of them had asked for. The board meeting 3 days later had been worse. 12 men in identical charcoal suits arranged around a mahogany table that cost more than a luxury sedan, all leaning forward with the same expression of patronizing concern. They'd outlined the transition plan, Nathaniel as CEO, Dominic as CFO, Benedict heading legal, and Cassandra, the baby the daughter, would serve as VP of Community Relations. A title designed to keep her visible but powerless, decorative but contained. She'd listened to them reorganize her life with the same detached efficiency they'd used to restructure a failing subsidiary. When they asked if she had any questions, she'd said no. When they asked if she agreed to the terms, she'd said yes. And when the meeting adjourned and they filed out already discussing lunch plans, she'd stayed in her seat, staring at the empty chair at the head of the table where her father used to sit. Nathaniel found her there an hour later. His voice had been gentle, careful. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do." She hadn't looked at him, just kept her eyes fixed on that empty chair. "They'll destroy everything Dad built if we don't hold the line." "Then hold it with us, as a partner, not a figurehead." "I don't know how to be a partner when I've never been anything but a name on the door." He'd pulled out the chair next to hers, sat down with that deliberate slowness that meant he was choosing his words carefully. Nathaniel was the strategist, the one who thought 12 moves ahead. Dominic was the fighter, all passion and protective rage. Benedict was the architect, building cases and contingencies with meticulous precision. And Cassandra was the youngest, the one they'd all spent their lives shielding. His next words had been quiet, almost a whisper. "If you need to leave, leave. But do it because you want to find yourself, not because you're running from us." "I'm not running from you." "Then what?" She'd finally turned to look at him, at those eyes that mirrored her own, dark and searching. "I need to know who I am when no one knows my last name. I need to know if anyone will ever see me instead of the fortune." Nathaniel had nodded slowly, understanding settling across his features. He'd reached into his jacket, pulled out a sleek black phone, placed it on the table between them. "Emergency contact only. If you need us, we're there in 2 hours. No questions, no judgment. And if I don't call, then we trust you're finding what you need to find." The freedom in those words had been terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She'd picked up the phone, held it for a moment, then slipped it into her purse. 3 days later, she'd moved out of the Thornfield penthouse and into a studio apartment in Hell's Kitchen that had water stains on the ceiling and radiators that clanged like church bells at 3 in the morning. She'd legally changed her identification to her mother's maiden name. Morgan filed the paperwork herself at a clerk's office in Queens where nobody recognized her face. Cassandra Morgan, anonymous, invisible, free. The job at the New York Public Library had been almost too perfect a position as an archivist in the manuscripts division, cataloging correspondence from dead authors touching history with gloved hands in climate-controlled silence. The other archivists were kind but distant, the kind of people who preferred the company of century-old letters to contemporary conversation. Perfect. For 6 months she'd lived quietly, carefully learning the rhythm of a life where money was something you counted before buying groceries, where deciding between a new winter coat and fixing your laptop was an actual dilemma that kept you up at night. She'd started taking the subway, standing in packed cars during rush hour, anonymous in the crowd. She'd learned which bodegas had the best coffee, which food carts stayed open late, which streets to avoid after dark. She'd become nobody, and it had felt like the first honest thing she'd done in her entire life. Until the afternoon Garrett Sullivan walked into her life and made her believe in fairy tales again. It was late September, one of those rare autumn days in New York, when the heat finally breaks and the air tastes clean for the first time in months. She'd finished her shift at the library and stopped at a small cafe 2 blocks away, the kind of place with mismatched furniture and walls covered in local art that would never sell. She'd been reading some paperback thriller she'd picked up at a used bookstore, lost enough in the story that she hadn't noticed the drunk man stumbling between tables until he was right next to her. The smell hit her first, that sour combination of cheap whiskey and unwashed clothes. Then his hand on her shoulder, heavy and insistent, his voice slurred and too loud. "Hey, sweetheart, buy me a drink. You look like you can afford it." She'd frozen, that instinct drilled into her by a childhood of self-defense classes, momentarily useless, her body remembering that she was supposed to be someone powerful, but her current reality offering no actual power at all. Then another hand, firm but not aggressive, on the drunk man's arm, guiding him away with surprising gentleness. A voice deep and calm that somehow cut through the man's alcoholic haze. "Hey, buddy, let's get you some air. There's a shelter 3 blocks east. They serve dinner at 6. Come on, I'll walk you there." The drunk man had blinked, confused but compliant, and allowed himself to be steered toward the door. Cassandra had watched surprised as the stranger, tall and well-dressed in a way that spoke of actual money, not just pretension, had guided the drunk man out onto the sidewalk, pointing him in the right direction with what looked like a $20 bill pressed into his palm. When he came back inside, brushing his hands together as if cleaning them, he'd caught her staring. His smile had been apologetic, self-deprecating. "Sorry about that. He's usually around the food bank on 42nd, but I guess he wandered. You okay?" "I'm fine. That was kind of you." "Not really. Just human." He'd hesitated, then gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Mind if I sit? I promise I'm not here to bother you. Just figured it's less awkward than me standing here hovering." She should have said no. Should have recognized the approach for what it was, smooth and practiced. But something in his face, a warmth that seemed genuine, or maybe just her loneliness finally overwhelming her caution, made her nod. He'd sat down, ordered a black coffee when the waitress came by, asked polite questions about her book, about the neighborhood, about nothing important. His name was Garrett Sullivan. He ran a logistics company. Something about supply chain optimization that he described with an enthusiasm that made boring subjects sound almost interesting. He was 35, never married, lived in Tribeca, liked jazz, and hated fusion cuisine. When she'd told him her name was Cass Morgan, archivist, he'd smiled like she'd said something delightful. An archivist? That's beautiful. You spend your days with history. Someone has to make sure the past doesn't get lost. And what about the present? Do you ever take breaks from the dead to pay attention to the living? The line should have been cheesy, should have made her roll her eyes and gather her things. Instead, she'd found herself smiling a real smile, the kind she hadn't felt stretch across her face in months. They'd talked for 2 hours. When she finally checked her phone and realized how late it had gotten, he'd offered to walk her home. No pressure, just safety. She'd declined but given him her number when he asked a random string of digits that connected to a prepaid phone she'd bought specifically to keep her old life separated from this new one. He'd called the next day. They'd met for coffee, then dinner, then a walk through Central Park where he'd pointed out constellations she'd never learned the names for and made up stories about them that were definitely not astronomical fact, but made her laugh anyway. 6 months of dating that felt like a dream she was afraid to wake from. He was attentive without being smothering, successful without being arrogant, interested in her thoughts in a way that felt genuine. He never pushed her about. Her family accepted her vague explanations about being estranged from her parents with sympathy rather than prying questions. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, because she was too busy falling in love with the idea of being loved for herself, was that Garrett already knew exactly who she was. The proposal came on a rainy March evening, 6 months to the day from that first conversation in the cafe. He'd taken her to the Bow Bridge in Central Park, that iconic spot that every tourist photographed and every local avoided for exactly that reason. But the rain had driven everyone away, leaving them alone with the city lights reflecting off the wet stone, the sound of water on leaves creating a privacy that felt almost sacred. He'd gotten down on one knee right there, water soaking through his expensive slacks, and pulled out a ring that was modest by Thornfield standards but probably cost him a month's salary. A simple solitaire, elegant and understated. His voice had been steady, certain. "Cass, I don't need to know where you came from or what you're running from. I just need to know if you'll build a future with me. Marry me." She'd said yes through tears, and he'd slipped the ring on her finger, and they'd kissed in the rain like characters in a movie neither of them would ever watch. The wedding 3 months later had been small, just a courthouse ceremony with 2 random witnesses pulled from the hallway outside the clerk's office. Garrett had suggested inviting his mother, but Cassandra had convinced him that starting fresh meant leaving old complications behind. He'd agreed easily, too easily, but she'd been too happy to notice. She'd worn a cream dress from a department store, he'd worn a navy suit, and when the clerk pronounced them married, she'd felt lighter than she had in years, untethered from expectation, free to build a life on her own terms. The first crack appeared on their wedding night. They'd booked a room at a boutique hotel in Brooklyn, nothing extravagant but nice enough to feel special. Garrett had carried her over the threshold like tradition demanded, set her down. Gently poured champagne into plastic cups because they'd forgotten to request glasses. They'd toasted to new beginnings, to building a life together, to all the promises people make when they believe love is enough. She'd drunk her champagne, feeling the bubbles tickle her nose, watching him watch her with an expression she'd interpreted as desire but would later recognize as calculation. When she'd reached for him, ready to consummate vows they'd somehow managed to avoid consummating during their courtship, he'd stepped back just slightly enough to create space between them. His voice had been different, cooler, like someone had adjusted the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "Actually, I'm exhausted. Long day. Mind if we just sleep?" She'd been surprised, but understanding fatigue from the day's emotions catching up with her too. They'd climbed into bed on opposite sides, and when she'd reached for his hand in the darkness, he'd let her hold it for exactly 30 seconds before pulling away with a murmured excuse about needing to stretch out. She'd fallen asleep, telling herself it was just nerves, just tiredness, just normal. The next morning, everything shifted. Garrett had woken early, already dressed, when she opened her eyes, scrolling through his phone with a focus that suggested whatever he was reading was more important than acknowledging his new wife. When she'd said good morning, he'd grunted something that might have been a greeting, might have been dismissal. Over breakfast at a diner 3 blocks from the hotel, he'd barely spoken, answering her attempts at conversation with monosyllables until she'd finally stopped trying. When the check came, he'd looked at it with the kind of irritation usually reserved for parking tickets, then looked at her. "You're not working anymore, right, since we're married?" The question had caught her off guard. "We never discussed that." "Well, we should discuss it now. My wife doesn't need to work. It looks bad, like I can't provide." "I like my job. I'm good at it." "You're good at organizing old papers. That's not a career, Cass. That's a hobby I've been indulging." The word indulging had landed like a slap, but she'd forced herself to stay calm to assume good intentions. "What if I want to keep working?" "Then I guess we have our first married disagreement." He'd pulled out his wallet, dropped 2 20s on the table without waiting for change, stood up. "Let's go home and talk about this properly." Home turned out to be his penthouse in Tribeca, a space she'd visited a dozen times during their courtship, but never really examined. Now, as he unlocked the door and ushered her inside, she looked at it with new eyes. Everything was expensive, carefully curated, designed to impress. Nothing looked lived in. Nothing suggested actual comfort. It felt like a showroom, a display of wealth rather than a home. Garrett had gone straight to his office, a room she'd never been invited into before emerging 30 minutes later with a folder. He'd dropped it on the kitchen counter between them. "Our finances. I've set up an account for you, $200 a week for groceries and incidentals. If you need anything major, ask me first." $200. It's generous. You've been living on poverty wages for a year. This should feel like luxury. She'd opened her mouth to argue, to explain that $200 a week was not generous by any reasonable standard, but something in his eyes stopped her. A hardness she'd never seen before, a challenge that suggested any pushback would be met with consequences she couldn't predict. So she'd closed her mouth, nodded, took the bank card he offered with fingers that had gone numb. That was the moment the fairy tale ended and the nightmare began, though she wouldn't recognize it as a nightmare for several more months. Humans have this remarkable capacity for self-deception, for explaining away red flags as temporary aberrations, for believing that love can overcome fundamental incompatibility. Cassandra told herself Garrett was just stressed about the marriage, adjusting to cohabitation, working through whatever issues he'd never mentioned during their courtship. She told herself it would get better once they settled into a routine, once the newness wore off, and they found their rhythm. It got worse. Within 2 months, Garrett had systematically isolated her from everything that made her feel human. He'd convinced her to quit her job at the library, framing it as financial practicality. Why waste time on minimum wage when his income could support them both? She'd resisted initially, but he'd worn her down with a combination of logical arguments and emotional manipulation that left her too exhausted to fight. Without work, her days became formless, purposeless. She'd tried volunteering, but Garrett had opinions about which organizations were worthy of her time. Opinions that mysteriously eliminated any option that would put her in contact with people who might ask questions or notice bruises that weren't physical but just as real. He monitored her phone, not overtly, but she'd catch him scrolling through her texts when he thought she was asleep, checking call logs, asking pointed questions about conversations she'd had with the few friends she'd maintained. Slowly, she stopped responding to messages, let relationships atrophy through neglect, until the only voice in her life besides her own was Garrett's. He criticized everything. The way she dressed made her look poor. The way she walked was embarrassing, lacking the grace expected of a woman married to a successful CEO. The meals she cooked were never quite right, too salty or too bland, too ambitious or too simple. Her opinions on current events were uninformed. Her taste in entertainment was pedestrian. Her very existence seemed to be a constant disappointment he was generously tolerating. The verbal abuse was insidious because it came wrapped in concern. He wasn't being cruel. He was trying to help her improve. He wasn't controlling. He was protecting her from her own poor judgment. He wasn't isolating her. He was building their life together, just the two of them against the world. And Cassandra, who'd spent her entire life being told she needed protection, who'd run away from her family specifically because she wanted to prove she could survive without their fortress of wealth, found herself trapped in a new kind of prison, one built from her own stubborn pride. She couldn't call her brothers, couldn't admit that her grand experiment in independence had led her straight into the arms of a man who was systematically destroying her sense of self. couldn't face the possibility that they'd been right to worry that maybe she'd needed their protection after all. So she endured, adapted, learned which topics to avoid, which facial expressions triggered his rage, which tiny rebellions she could get away with in the privacy of her own mind. She became a ghost in her own life, haunting the edges of Garrett's existence, trying to take up as little space as possible. Then, 14 months into the marriage, she discovered she was pregnant. The test had shown positive on a Tuesday morning, 2 pink lines that filled her with a terror so profound she'd had to sit on the bathroom floor until the shaking stopped. She knew with absolute certainty that this would make everything worse. A baby meant permanence, meant she was bound to Garrett not just by vows, but by biology, by the tiny cluster of cells currently dividing in her uterus with no awareness of the disaster it was being born into. She'd hidden the test, shoved it deep in the bathroom trash, bought herself 3 days before she couldn't hide it anymore. When she finally told Garrett over dinner that she'd cooked to his exact specifications, she'd braced herself for his reaction. He'd gone very still, fork frozen halfway to his mouth, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to identify. Then he'd set the fork down, carefully folded his napkin with precise movements, and looked at her with an expression of such profound disgust that she'd actually flinched. "You're pregnant?" "Yes." "How far along?" 6 weeks, maybe 7. I haven't seen a doctor yet." "Great. Perfect. Now you'll be even more useless." He'd pushed back from the table, stood up, paced to the window overlooking the city. When he turned back, his face had rearranged itself into something approximating concern, but the disgust still leaked through around the edges. "Well, I guess we're doing this. You'll need to start taking vitamins, seeing a doctor, all that pregnancy stuff. And for God's sake, try not to get huge. Some women barely show. Try to be one of them." That night, alone in the bedroom while Garrett worked late in his office, Cassandra had pulled out the emergency phone Nathaniel had given her 3 years ago. She'd charged it, waited for it to power on, stared at the single contact saved in the directory. Her thumb had hovered over the call button for 20 minutes. Tears streaming down her face. The baby inside her, no bigger than a blueberry but already changing everything. She didn't make the call. Instead, she'd bought a cheap recording device at an electronics store in Queens, paid cash, told the clerk she was a journalist working on an investigative piece. She'd started documenting everything, every cruel comment, every demeaning interaction, building a case file against her own husband with the meticulous attention to detail her archivist training had instilled. If she was going to leave, when she finally found the courage to leave, she'd make damn sure he couldn't follow. The pregnancy progressed. Her body changed, swelling and shifting in ways that Garrett found increasingly revolting. He stopped touching her entirely by the 4th month, moved into the guest bedroom by the 5th, started staying late at the office with increasing frequency by the 6th. That's when Claudette Winters entered the picture. Cassandra had met her at a company dinner. Garrett had insisted she attend one of those obligatory social functions where wives were expected to smile and stay silent while the men discussed business. Claudette was Garrett's new executive assistant, 26 years old, blonde, beautiful in that calculated way that suggested professional maintenance rather than genetics. She'd been polite to Cassandra, professionally pleasant, but there'd been something in her eyes when she looked at Garrett, a familiarity that went beyond administrative efficiency. The way she touched his arm when making a point, how she laughed at his mediocre jokes with genuine-seeming enthusiasm, the casual intimacy of someone who spent more waking hours with him than his wife did. Cassandra had watched them interact all evening and understood exactly what was happening. Part of her felt relief. If Garrett was getting his needs met elsewhere, maybe he'd leave her alone, let her pregnancy progress in peace. The relief lasted until she overheard them talking in Garrett's office 3 weeks later. She'd come by to drop off documents he'd left at home, let herself in with the key he'd given her for emergencies, not expecting anyone to be there at 8 on a Saturday night. But voices from his office had stopped her in the reception area. Garrett's voice and Claudette's low and intimate. She'd moved closer, hating herself for eavesdropping, but unable to stop, and caught fragments of conversation that rearranged her understanding of everything. Garrett's voice, frustration evident. "Just need to wait until after the baby's born. Custody gives me leverage." Claudette, practical and cold. And if she fights it, she won't. She thinks she's alone. No family, no support system. Once I have custody, I can access the trust through child support payments. Her family won't let their grandchild suffer in poverty. You're sure they're that rich? $3 billion portfolio minimum. The Thornfield name is worth more than most corporations, and my idiot wife thinks she's been so clever hiding from them. Cassandra had stopped breathing. Her legs had gone numb. The baby kicked, oblivious to the fact that its mother's world was imploding. He knew. He'd always known. Everything, the whole courtship, the marriage, the carefully constructed love story, all of it had been a con. She wasn't his wife. She was his mark. She'd backed away silently. Left the building, walked 12 blocks before her shaking legs refused to carry her further. She'd collapsed onto a bench in a small park surrounded by the sounds of the city and finally let herself understand the full scope of her mistake. But understanding didn't equal action. She was 7 months pregnant, financially dependent, legally bound to a man who'd been planning to use her child as a bargaining chip before it even drew its first breath. She had recordings, but what good were recordings when she had nowhere to go, no resources to fight, no way to protect herself and the baby growing inside her? That night, for the second time, she'd pulled out the emergency phone, and for the second time she'd put it away without making the call. Because Cassandra Thornfield had spent her entire life being saved, and some stubborn, broken part of her still needed to prove she could save herself. 2 months later, 8 months pregnant and exhausted, she'd stood in their bedroom watching Garrett adjust his tuxedo in the mirror, preparing for the winter charity gala at the Pierre Hotel. "Do I have to go? My back is killing me," and the doctor said, "I don't care what the doctor said. Goldman Sachs will be there. I need you on my arm, looking like a successful man's wife, not hiding at home like an embarrassment." "Garrett, please." He'd spun to face her, his expression dark. "You'll wear the navy dress, the one that hides your stomach, as much as possible. You'll stand behind me. You won't speak unless spoken to. And you'll smile like you're grateful to be there. Understand?" She'd nodded, too tired to fight, and let him shepherd her into the limousine an hour later. Now standing in the ballroom with champagne dripping from her hair, Cassandra felt something inside her break and reform into something harder, sharper. The string quartet had started playing again, conversations resuming in awkward stutters, the moment stretching into an eternity. Then the main doors opened and 3 men walked in. They moved with synchronized precision. Expensive suits that made everyone else's formal wear look like costume rental, an aura of power so palpable that the crowd parted instinctively. Nathaniel in the center, his dark eyes scanning the room until they locked on Cassandra. Dominic to his left, younger, but no less imposing, his jaw tight with barely contained rage. Benedict to his right, the youngest of her brothers, but carrying himself with the authority of someone who'd won every argument he'd ever entered. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. Not shocked, but reverent. These were the Thornfield brothers, and their presence meant someone was about to lose everything. Garrett, oblivious to the danger, saw only opportunity. He straightened his tie, pasted on his most charming smile, started walking toward them with the confidence of a man who didn't know he was already dead. Garrett Sullivan had built his entire career on reading rooms, on identifying the most powerful person present, and aligning himself accordingly. But power, real power, doesn't announce itself with volume or flash. It walks quietly, speaks softly, and destroys completely. He extended his hand toward Nathaniel Thornfield, his smile wide and practiced. "Mr. Thornfield, Garrett Sullivan Logistics. I've been trying to get a meeting with your procurement team for months. I think we could offer rates that would significantly improve your shipping costs on the East Coast operations." Nathaniel didn't break stride, didn't acknowledge the outstretched hand, didn't even shift his gaze to register Garrett's existence. He simply walked through the space Garrett occupied, forcing him to stumble backward or be trampled, treating him with the same casual dismissal one might give a piece of furniture inconveniently placed in a hallway. The rejection was so absolute, so public, that several people in the immediate vicinity actually gasped. In a room where social currency mattered more than actual currency, Garrett had just been declared worthless. His face flushed dark red, humiliation flooding through him with physical force. He glanced around, saw the barely concealed smirks, the knowing glances exchanged between people who'd witnessed his attempt at networking faceplant into spectacular failure. Claudette Winters, who'd been standing 20 feet away pretending not to watch, took 3 calculated steps backward, increasing the distance between them. Even she recognized a sinking ship when she saw one. Garrett needed a target, needed to reassert dominance, needed to make someone smaller so he could feel large again. His eyes found Cassandra still standing by table 12, champagne drying sticky on her skin, one hand protective over her swollen belly. Of course. His useless wife sitting there looking pathetic and bloated, probably the reason the Thornfields had snubbed him. If he'd arrived alone, looked successful and unencumbered, maybe they would have given him the time of day. He crossed the ballroom in long strides, his anger building with each step, feeding on itself, until by the time he reached her, he was vibrating with rage that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with his own inadequacy. She looked up at him, her dark eyes wary, already bracing. Good. She should brace. This is your fault. The words came out low, vicious, meant only for her, but loud enough that the people at adjacent tables could hear if they strained. I just got humiliated by the most powerful man in New York, and I look over here and see you slouching like some kind of charity case. You're an embarrassment, Cassandra. Look at you. Garrett, please. Everyone's watching. Let them watch. His voice rose, abandoning any pretense of privacy. I'm tired of pretending you're anything other than dead weight. You bring nothing to this marriage, no money, no connections, no class. I pulled you out of poverty, and this is how you repay me, by making me look weak. She flinched, and the flinch enraged him further. How dare she act wounded when she was the one ruining his life, trapping him with a pregnancy he'd never wanted from a woman he'd only married for access to a fortune she didn't even have the spine to claim. You told me you were estranged from your family. You said they had nothing, that you were alone. He was shouting now, all pretense of control abandoned. But you're not estranged. You're just a coward who ran away from them, and now I'm stuck with a wife who can't even provide basic social value. Cassandra's jaw tightened, her hand moving protectively over her stomach. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, measured nothing like the meek acceptance he'd grown accustomed to. You should stop talking. Don't tell me what to do. You don't get to tell me anything. You exist because I allow it. Without me, you'd be homeless, pregnant, with nowhere to go. So sit there, shut up, and try not to make me look worse than you already have. He'd picked up a fresh glass of champagne from a passing waiter at some point, muscle memory, in a room where holding a drink was part of the uniform. Now he gestured with it, his movements sharp and aggressive, and whether by accident or design, his wrist flicked forward. The amber liquid arced through the air in a perfect parabola, catching light from the chandeliers, and splashed directly across Cassandra's face for the second time that evening. The room, which had been buzzing with resumed conversation, went silent again. This time the silence felt dangerous. Cassandra sat perfectly still, champagne dripping from her chin, her eyes closed. When she opened them, something in her expression had fundamentally changed. The fear was gone, burned away by something harder and infinitely more terrifying. A shadow fell across their table. Garrett turned to find Dominic Thornfield standing behind him, close enough that Garrett could smell his cologne, something expensive and understated that probably cost more than Garrett's entire suit. Dominic's voice was conversational, almost friendly. You seem to be having a difficult evening. Garrett blinked, confusion cutting through his anger. I'm sorry, I don't... That woman you just assaulted. Dominic gestured toward Cassandra without looking at her. The one you threw a drink on twice in the last 10 minutes. The one you've been screaming at in front of 300 witnesses. Do you know who she is? She's my wife. This is a private matter. Your wife. Dominic smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made intelligent people check for exits. Interesting, because she looks remarkably similar to our baby sister. Same eyes, same bone structure, same stubborn chin that our father always said came from our mother's side of the family. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Garrett's feet. What? Nathaniel and Benedict had moved into position flanking Dominic, creating a wall of expensive wool and controlled menace. Nathaniel held a leather folder, the kind lawyers carry when they're about to ruin someone's life. Benedict's voice was clinical, detached, the tone of someone reading a particularly boring grocery list. Cassandra Elizabeth Thornfield, born October 14th, daughter of Henry Thornfield, deceased, and Margaret Thornfield, also deceased. Primary beneficiary of a trust valued at approximately $4.3 billion, pending her 30th birthday or the birth of her first child, whichever comes first. Sole heir to Thornfield Industries upon reaching majority stake age, which, given that baby she's currently carrying, would be in approximately 6 weeks when the child is born. Garrett's vision tunneled. His ears rang. Every molecule of oxygen seemed to have been sucked from the room. No. She told me, she said she was an orphan, that her family was gone, that she had nothing. She lied. Nathaniel's voice cut through Garrett's spiraling panic like a surgical blade. Specifically, she gave you the opportunity to love her for who she was, rather than what she had. Apparently, you failed that test rather spectacularly. Cassandra stood slow and deliberate, wiping champagne from her face with a napkin someone had handed her. When she looked at Garrett, her expression was utterly blank, carved from marble, revealing nothing. "Hello, Garrett. I'd like you to meet my brothers, Nathaniel Dominic Benedict. Gentlemen, this is the man I married under the mistaken impression that he saw me as a human being rather than a financial opportunity." Garrett's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. His brain was trying to process information that contradicted 2 years of carefully constructed assumptions, and the cognitive dissonance was physically painful. Nathaniel opened the leather folder with movements so precise they seemed choreographed. He pulled out a stack of papers, began laying them on the table one by one like a dealer distributing cards in a game Garrett hadn't known he was playing. "Let's discuss what we know, shall we? 3 years ago, you hired Winston Investigations, a private firm specializing in background checks and surveillance." He laid down the first document, a contract bearing Garrett's signature. "You paid them $15,000 over 3 months to compile a comprehensive dossier on one Cassandra Morgan, alias real name Cassandra Thornfield." Garrett's stomach dropped into freefall. "I can explain." The report included photographs of Cassandra leaving the Thornfield Industries building, detailed family trees, estimated net worth calculations, and a rather thorough timeline of her movements over a 6-month period. Another document, this one showing photographs Garrett recognized, images he'd studied obsessively while planning his approach. Interestingly, the final report was delivered 3 weeks before your supposedly chance encounter at a cafe near the New York Public Library. "That's not... I didn't..." Benedict took over, his voice still maintaining that terrifying neutrality. "We have emails, Mr. Sullivan. Quite a lot of them. Correspondence between you and the investigator discussing the best approach strategy. Your words, and I quote, 'Target confirmed. Ashford heiress in disguise. Need clean approach, something that looks organic. She can't suspect she's being hunted.'" The word hunted landed like a physical blow. Several nearby guests had abandoned any pretense of not listening openly, staring now, phones out, recording. Dominic pulled out his own phone, swiped through screens with deliberate slowness. "We also have your financial records. Bank transfers showing regular payments to the investigator. Credit card receipts for a storage unit in Queens where you kept the full surveillance report because apparently you're not smart enough to destroy evidence. And my personal favorite, a folder on your laptop labeled Thornfield Project containing spreadsheets calculating potential return on investment for a marriage lasting 3 to 5 years. Cassandra made a small sound, something between a laugh and a sob. Garrett couldn't look at her, couldn't look at anyone. His entire body felt like it was shutting down, every system failing simultaneously. "You knew." Her voice cut through his panic, quiet but carrying. "From the very beginning you knew exactly who I was." Yes. But I did fall in love with you. Eventually. The feelings became real. You hired someone to stalk me for 3 months, then engineered a meeting designed to make me think you were my savior." Each word came out precise, surgical. "Every conversation we had, every moment of connection I felt was choreographed. You studied me like I was a mark in a con, and I was too desperate to be loved for myself to see it." Garrett grasped at the only defense he had left: the truth that had sustained him through 2 years of playing a role. "You lied, too. You pretended to be poor, to have nothing. You deceived me just as much as I deceived you." Nathaniel's hand shot out, gripping Garrett's shoulder with enough force to make him gasp. "She wanted to know if anyone could love her without the money. You wanted to know how to steal the money by pretending to love her. These are not equivalent deceptions." The crowd had grown, circling their small drama like sharks scenting blood. Phones everywhere, capturing every moment, the humiliation being documented for posterity and social media immortality. Claudette chose that moment to make her escape attempt, edging toward the main doors with the casual urgency of someone trying not to draw attention while moving as quickly as possible without actually running. Benedict's voice stopped her mid-step. "Miss Winters, I wouldn't recommend leaving just yet. We have questions." She froze, then turned with obvious reluctance, her face cycling through expressions as she calculated odds and came up short. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just his assistant." His assistant who's been coordinating with him to isolate Cassandra from potential support systems. Benedict pulled out another phone, a different model, this one in a pink case. "This is yours, I believe. Left in Mr. Sullivan's office 3 days ago when you were there at 11 p.m. for what I'm sure was strictly professional business. We've had time to examine the contents. Very illuminating." Claudette's confident facade crumbled. "He said if I helped him I'd get 10% when the divorce went through and he got custody. He said Cassandra would never fight for the kid that she'd just handed over." "Shut up!" Garrett's voice cracked across the word desperation, making him sharp. "Just shut your mouth, Claudette." But Claudette was in survival mode now, the kind of panic that makes people jettison loyalty to save themselves. He had a whole plan. Keep her pregnant, keep her isolated, wait until the baby was born, then file for divorce and custody. He said once he had the kid, the Thornfield family would pay anything to have their grandchild raised properly. He called it a golden ticket. The cruelty of it hung in the air, undeniable and documented. Cassandra's hand moved to her stomach again, protective, and this time Garrett saw the gesture for what it was. Not weakness, but fierce maternal defense of a child she'd been carrying while its father plotted to use it as leverage. Nathaniel's expression darkened into something truly frightening. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Gentlemen, please escort Mr. Sullivan from the premises. Miss Winters, you'll stay for further questioning." 2 security guards materialized from the edges of the room, moving with professional efficiency toward Garrett. He stumbled backward, hands raised in a placating gesture that fooled no one. "Wait, just wait. We can discuss this. I made mistakes, I admit that, but we can work through this. Cassandra, please. Think about the baby. Our child needs a father." Cassandra stepped forward close enough that Garrett could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes. The same eyes he'd gazed into while whispering practiced endearments designed to make her feel cherished. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, which somehow made the words cut deeper. "You never once asked my last name. In 6 months of dating, you never asked because you already knew. You knew everything about me except the one thing that mattered, whether I deserved to be treated like a person." The security guards took his arms, professional but firm. As they guided him toward the exit, Garrett craned his neck back, searching for something, anything to salvage from the wreckage of his grand plan. "This isn't over. I have rights. You can't just—" The ballroom doors closed behind him, cutting off his protests mid-sentence. The silence that followed was profound, shock the kind that follows a car crash when everyone's still processing what they witnessed. Then slowly conversation resumed, hushed and urgent, the story already being texted, tweeted, shared across networks before Garrett had even reached the street. Cassandra swayed slightly, the adrenaline that had kept her upright draining away all at once. Dominic caught her elbow, steadying her with surprising gentleness. "Easy. Let's get you somewhere quiet." They moved through the crowd, which parted with respectful speed toward a service elevator that led to the hotel's private floors. Someone, probably Nathaniel, had arranged for access to a suite because the elevator opened directly into a living room that cost more per night than most people's monthly rent. Cassandra sank onto a velvet sofa, her hands shaking now that there was no audience to perform strength for. Benedict disappeared into the suite's interior, returning moments later with water and what looked like a medical bag. "I took the liberty of having the hotel doctor on standby. Given your condition, I'm fine." The words came out automatic, a reflex honed by 2 years of minimizing her own needs. Then quieter, more honest. "Actually, I'm not fine. But the baby's okay. I can feel her moving." Nathaniel sat in the chair across from her, elbows on his knees, his carefully controlled facade showing cracks. "Her... probably. The doctor couldn't tell for sure, but I have this feeling." She pressed her palm flat against her stomach. "Victoria. I was going to name her Victoria. After grandmother." Dominic's voice was rough, emotional, in a way his face refused to show. "She'd like that." The hotel doctor arrived, a woman in her 50s, who conducted a brief but thorough examination, checking Cassandra's blood pressure, listening to the baby's heartbeat with a portable monitor, asking questions about contractions and fluid. Finally, she straightened, packing her equipment away with efficient movements. "Mother and baby are both stable. Blood pressure's elevated, but not dangerously so. I recommend rest, hydration, and absolutely no more dramatic confrontations for at least the next 6 weeks." "I'll do my best." Cassandra accepted the water bottle Benedict handed her, drank half of it in one long swallow. After the doctor left, the 4 of them sat in silence, processing the evening's revelations. It was Cassandra who finally spoke, her voice small and raw. "How long have you known about Garrett, about what he was doing?" Nathaniel exchanged glances with his brothers before answering. 18 months. We hired our own investigators 6 months after you left, not to interfere, just to make sure you were safe. When you got married, we dug deeper. Found the connection to Winston investigations, started pulling threads. We've been building a case for over a year." "Why didn't you tell me? Because you needed to decide to leave on your own terms?" Benedict's analytical voice softened slightly. "If we'd swooped in and rescued you, you'd have spent the rest of your life wondering if you could have done it yourself. We gave you space to choose." "I didn't choose. I couldn't. I was trapped." Tears spilled over, running down her champagne-sticky cheeks. "I knew he was using me. I knew about the plan for custody. I recorded everything and I still couldn't leave. What does that say about me?" Dominic moved to sit beside her, his arm around her shoulders, in a gesture of protection that was purely brotherly. "It says you're human. It says you were in an abusive situation designed to make you feel powerless. It says you survived long enough for the truth to matter." "He's going to lose everything." Cassandra said it without satisfaction, just exhausted observation. "His company, his reputation, his freedom?" "Yes." Nathaniel's voice held no pity. "Starting tomorrow morning. We've already filed paperwork with the SEC. His company has been cooking the books for years, hiding debts in offshore accounts. The IRS will be very interested, as will the FBI, given that he committed marriage fraud, which is a federal crime when it involves deliberate deception for financial gain. The board will vote to remove him by noon tomorrow." Benedict pulled out his phone, checked something, then continued. "We purchased his company's debt 3 days ago. Technically, Thornfield Industries now owns Sullivan Logistics. The board doesn't know it yet, but they'll receive notice at 9 a.m. Claudette's testimony will help." Dominic's voice carried grim satisfaction. "She's already agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity. Turns out she kept copies of everything insurance policy in case Garrett decided to cut her out. She's singing like she's auditioning for Carnegie Hall." Cassandra closed her eyes, letting the reality settle over her. 2 years of her life gone. 2 years of systematic abuse, isolation, degradation, all orchestrated by a man who saw her as a financial instrument rather than a person. And now he'd face consequences, legal and social and financial, but none of it would give her back the time she'd lost or heal the damage he'd inflicted. "I want to go home." The words came out small, childlike. "Not to the penthouse. Home." Nathaniel stood, already pulling out his phone to make arrangements. "The estate in the Hamptons or the penthouse in Manhattan?" "The estate. I want space. I want quiet. I want to not see another person besides family for at least a month." Done. The helicopter can be ready in 30 minutes. She almost laughed. Of course they had a helicopter on standby. Of course they'd planned for every contingency. That was what Thornfields did. They controlled variables, eliminated threats, protected their own with overwhelming force. For the first time in 3 years, she let herself be grateful for that protection instead of suffocated by it. The flight to the Hamptons took 45 minutes, the city lights giving way to darkness, and then the distant glow of coastline estates. The Thornfield compound sprawled across 12 acres of prime beachfront property, the main house a modern glass and steel structure that somehow managed to feel warm despite its architectural coldness. Cassandra hadn't seen it in 3 years. As the helicopter touched down on the private pad, she felt emotion rise in her throat, threatening to choke her. This was the place where she'd grown up, where she'd learned to swim in the Olympic-sized pool, where she'd hidden in the library, reading historical romances while her brothers argued about market projections in the next room. The staff had been alerted. Mrs. Chen, the housekeeper who'd worked for the family since before Cassandra was born, waited at the entrance with tears streaming down her face. "Miss Cassandra, oh, thank God. We've been so worried." Cassandra let herself be enfolded in a hug that smelled like lavender and baking bread, the scent of childhood and safety. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Chen. I should have called." "Hush now. You're home. That's what matters." They set her up in her old bedroom, which had been maintained exactly as she'd left it, down to the books on the nightstand and the dried flowers from her senior prom in a vase on the dresser. Someone probably misses. Chen had turned down the bed and left a cup of herbal tea steaming on the side table. Cassandra showered, washing away the champagne and the humiliation and the last traces of the woman she'd been pretending to be for 2 years. When she emerged wrapped in a robe that was soft and expensive and comforting, she found all 3 of her brothers waiting in the sitting area attached to her bedroom. They'd changed out of their tuxedos into casual clothes, looking more human and less like avenging corporate angels. Nathaniel had brought a folder because of course he had. Business never stopped even at midnight after destroying someone's life. He set it on the coffee table between them. "We need to discuss next steps." "Can't it wait until morning?" "Some of it, yes, but there are time-sensitive elements." He opened the folder, revealing more documents, more evidence of Garrett's systematic betrayal. "The private investigator we hired to investigate Winston investigations found additional information. Garrett's been in contact with a family law attorney for 6 months, planning the custody battle. He was going to file for divorce 2 weeks after the baby was born, claiming you were an unfit mother due to mental instability." Based on what evidence? Evidence he was manufacturing. The isolation wasn't just cruelty, it was strategy. No friends, no support system, no witnesses to contradict whatever narrative he wanted to construct. He was going to claim you were depressed, potentially dangerous, that the baby would be better off in his custody. Benedict added his own documentation to the pile. We also found communication between Garrett and a journalist at the New York Post. He was planning to leak a story about you, portraying you as an heiress who abandoned her family responsibilities, painting himself as the stable influence trying to protect his child from an unstable mother. The manipulation was so thorough, so calculated, that Cassandra felt dizzy trying to track all the angles. Garrett hadn't just married her for money. He'd constructed an entire multi-year strategy to extract maximum value while minimizing risk. "There's more." Dominic's voice was gentle, which meant what came next was going to hurt. "The prenuptial agreement you signed. We had it analyzed. It's a template downloaded from the internet, completely unenforceable in New York State. But there's a clause about separately acquired property that actually works in your favor. Since your trust and shares were yours before marriage, he has no claim to them, even in a divorce." Why would he use an unenforceable prenup? Because he never planned to rely on it. He was going to use custody as leverage, negotiating a settlement that gave him access to Thornfield money through child support and trust provisions for the baby. The prenup was just cover, making you think you had no options. Cassandra's brain was struggling to process the layers of deception, each revelation adding weight to the crushing realization of how thoroughly she'd been played. He spent 2 years of his life on this con. 2 years and $15,000 in investigation fees plus whatever he paid his lawyer for strategy sessions. Nathaniel's voice was clinical, but his eyes betrayed fury. He saw you as an investment, and he was willing to put in the time to see returns. She should feel rage, should feel vindicated that her brothers were dismantling Garrett's life with the same systematic precision he'd used to construct his trap. Instead, she just felt hollow, scraped clean of emotion, operating on autopilot. What happens now? Tomorrow, several things occur simultaneously. Nathaniel ticked off items on his fingers. The board of Sullivan Logistics receives notice that their company's debt has been acquired by Thornfield Industries. They'll have an emergency meeting, discover the extent of Garrett's financial fraud, and vote to remove him as CEO. The SEC will receive documentation of securities violations. The IRS will receive evidence of tax evasion through offshore accounts. And you will file for divorce with prejudice, citing fraud, abuse, and criminal misconduct. And Garrett will spend the next 6 months fighting federal charges while watching everything he built collapse. Benedict's satisfaction was barely concealed. His legal fees alone will bankrupt him. By the time the criminal trial concludes, he'll be lucky if he can afford a studio apartment in Queens. It should feel like justice. Cassandra told herself it was justice that Garrett deserved every consequence heading his way like a freight train. But part of her, the part that had loved him, or thought she loved him, the part that had married him believing in fairy tales, mourned the death of the man she'd thought he was. "I need to sleep." She stood swaying slightly, exhaustion crashing over her in waves. "Can we finish this in the morning?" Her brothers left, filing out with murmured goodnights and promises to be there when she woke. Alone finally, Cassandra climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, feeling the baby shift and settle inside her. She placed her hand over the spot where tiny feet pressed against her ribs. "It's just you and me now, Victoria. And 3 very protective uncles who will probably spoil you rotten. We're going to be okay." The baby kicked in response, and Cassandra let herself cry for the first time since the champagne hit her face, silent tears soaking into the pillow as she mourned the woman she'd been and began the painful work of becoming someone new. 48 hours later. The destruction of Garrett Sullivan's life happened with brutal efficiency. Day 1 began at 6 a.m. when FBI agents arrived at his temporary hotel room with a warrant for his electronics. By 9, the board of Sullivan Logistics had received certified notice that their operating debt had been acquired by Thornfield Industries. By 10, an emergency board meeting had been convened. By noon, Garrett had been voted out as CEO, with only his own dissenting vote removed for moral turpitude and financial malfeasance. Wall Street Journal broke the story at 2 p.m. CEO exposed in marriage fraud scandal, company finances in question. By evening, every major outlet had picked it up. Garrett's face plastered across screens with headlines that destroyed reputation faster than any legal proceeding could. Day 2 brought the real pain. Bank of America froze his personal accounts pending investigation into suspicious transfers. His penthouse, owned by a holding company that turned out to be Thornfield-controlled, received eviction notice. Goldman Sachs canceled their partnership agreement, citing reputational concerns, and Claudette Winters, interviewed by federal prosecutors, provided testimony that connected every dot in Garrett's conspiracy. By the end of the second day, Garrett Sullivan had lost his company, his home, his savings, his reputation, and his future in that order. Cassandra watched it unfold from the safety of the Hamptons estate, Benedict providing updates with the detached professionalism of a battlefield correspondent reporting casualties. Each piece of news should have felt like victory. Instead, it just felt heavy, the weight of consequences that were deserved but still devastating to witness. 2 weeks after the gala, her water broke at 3 in the morning. The contractions started mild, almost gentle, then intensified with shocking speed. By the time the private medical team arrived, she was in active labor, her body doing what bodies have done for millennia, bringing new life into a world that felt simultaneously terrifying and full of possibility. Her brothers hovered useless and panicked, their usual competence deserting them in the face of biology they couldn't control or negotiate with. Nathaniel paced, wearing a track in the expensive carpet. Dominic kept asking if there was anything he could do, his hands clenching and unclenching helplessly. Benedict, normally the calm one, looked faintly green. The doctor, a woman named Rivera, who'd delivered half the society babies on the East Coast, found their panic amusing. "Gentlemen, she's giving birth, not dying. Although given how you're acting, I might need to treat you for stress-induced heart attacks." 7 hours of labor, an eternity of pain and pressure and primal effort, and then Victoria Grace Thornfield entered the world screaming her displeasure at the cold and the light and the shocking transition from liquid warmth to air. They placed her on Cassandra's chest, this tiny furious creature with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would eventually settle into the Thornfield brown. She was perfect. She was terrifying. She was everything. Cassandra looked down at her daughter and understood with crystalline clarity that she would burn the world down before letting anyone hurt this child the way she'd been hurt. The nurse cleaned Victoria, wrapped her in hospital-grade blankets that somehow looked inadequate, handed her back. Cassandra held her daughter and felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of herself. She wasn't just a woman who'd been betrayed. She was a mother now responsible for protecting and nurturing and teaching this new person how to exist in a world that would try to define her by her last name and her trust fund. Her brothers crowded around their faces, cycling through expressions of awe and terror and fierce protectiveness. Dominic reached out one finger, let Victoria's tiny hand wrap around it, and looked like he might cry. "Hello, Victoria. I'm your Uncle Dominic. I'm going to teach you how to negotiate hostile takeovers and make grown men cry in boardrooms." "You're going to do no such thing." Nathaniel's voice was gruff with emotion. "I'm Uncle Nathaniel. I'm going to teach you about responsible corporate governance and ethical business practices." Benedict smiled. "Uncle Benedict, I'll teach you contract law and how to destroy people legally." Cassandra laughed, a sound that surprised her with its genuineness. "She's 2 hours old. Can we maybe start with teaching her to sleep through the night?" They stayed like that for a long time, the four of them, plus Victoria, a family reconstructed around new life, until visiting hours ended and the brothers were gently but firmly evicted by Nurse Rivera, who informed them that mothers needed rest more than they needed hovering relatives. Alone with her daughter, Cassandra whispered promises into the quiet hospital room. "I will never lie to you about who we are. I will never make you small to make someone else comfortable. I will teach you that kindness is strength, not weakness, and that the right person will love you for your heart, not your bank account." Victoria yawned, unimpressed by maternal vows, and fell asleep with the confidence of someone who had no idea how complicated the world would be. Cassandra held her and felt for the first time in years something that might eventually become peace. 4 months postpartum. Cassandra stood in front of the full-length mirror in her bedroom at the Hamptons estate, adjusting the collar of a white silk blouse that felt like armor. Her body had changed, marked by the physical evidence of creating life softer in some places, harder in others, silver lines mapping the journey from woman to mother. She looked different because she was different. The woman staring back wasn't the meek archivist who'd let herself be controlled, and she wasn't the broken wife who'd endured abuse in silence. This woman had steel in her spine and murder in her eyes when it came to protecting her daughter. Victoria was downstairs with Mrs. Chen, probably being spoiled with attention that would create a monster if Cassandra didn't establish boundaries soon. But today, boundaries weren't the priority. Today was about justice, consequences, and the final confrontation with a man who'd spent 2 years systematically destroying her sense of self while planning to steal her child. Nathaniel knocked once, then entered without waiting for permission. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost $10,000, his expression set in the neutral mask he used for board meetings and depositions. "The car's ready. Benedict's already at the courthouse doing final prep with the prosecution team." "I don't have to testify, right? You said I wouldn't have to take the stand." "Correct. Your recorded evidence and documentation are sufficient. The prosecutors have Claudette as their star witness. She's been very cooperative once we explained the alternative was federal prison for conspiracy." Cassandra picked up her purse, checked its contents for the 3rd time. Lipstick tissues, the emergency phone she still carried despite being surrounded by family again. Old habits from the year of living alone, when that phone was her only lifeline. The drive to Manhattan took 90 minutes, Long Island Expressway, surprisingly clear for a Tuesday morning. Dominic drove his hands steady on the wheel of the armored SUV that Nathaniel insisted was necessary, given the media attention. Cassandra sat in the back, watching suburbs blur into city, her mind circling through thoughts that had kept her awake the night before. She'd prepared for months, worked with therapists to process trauma, rehearsed her victim impact statement until the words stopped feeling like they belonged to someone else. But preparation couldn't eliminate the fundamental anxiety of facing Garrett again, of being in the same room with a man who'd weaponized her desire to be loved. The New York Supreme Court building rose ahead, its neoclassical columns designed to inspire confidence in justice's ability to sort right from wrong. A crowd had gathered on the steps, reporters with cameras, protesters with signs, either condemning Garrett or condemning wealthy people and general opportunists selling coffee to spectators, treating this like entertainment. Dominic pulled into an underground entrance reserved for witnesses and victims, avoiding the circus above. Security guards checked identification, waved them through metal detectors, escorted them to a private waiting room where Benedict was already pacing legal briefs scattered across a conference table. He looked up when they entered, his expression shifting from concentration to concern. "You ready for this?" "No, but I'm doing it anyway." The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, more intimate, designed for proceedings rather than spectacle, despite the spectacle happening anyway. The gallery was packed, every seat filled with journalists, legal observers, and random citizens who'd waited in line since dawn for a chance to witness Garrett Sullivan's fall. Cassandra took her seat in the front row, flanked by her brothers, a wall of Thornfield protection that made her simultaneously grateful and claustrophobic. Across the aisle, Garrett sat at the defense table with his court-appointed attorney, an overworked public defender who'd drawn the short straw when Garrett's assets were frozen and his high-priced legal team abandoned him. He'd aged. That was Cassandra's first thought when she saw him, the shock of recognizing someone familiar, rendered strange by time and consequence. His hair had gone gray at the temples. His skin had that sallow quality from fluorescent lights and institutional food. His suit hung loose on a frame that had lost 20 pounds. When he turned and saw her, something flickered across his face. Regret maybe, or just residual calculation, wondering if there was still some angle to play. She met his eyes and felt nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, just the blank neutrality of looking at a stranger who'd once occupied space in her life and now didn't. The bailiff called for order. The judge, a black woman in her 60s with a reputation for intolerance toward white-collar criminals who thought their education made them special, entered and took the bench with efficient movements. The prosecution's opening statement painted Garrett as a predator who'd weaponized romance to access wealth, documenting systematic deception with evidence so overwhelming that the defense attorney barely bothered with objections. Emails, bank transfers, private investigator reports, surveillance footage of Garrett meeting with Winston Investigations to discuss approach strategies. Then came the recordings. Benedict had worked with the prosecution to edit them down to the most damning clips, removing redundancy while preserving impact. Garrett's voice filled the courtroom, tinny through speakers, but unmistakable, discussing Cassandra like she was a business opportunity rather than a human being. 3 years of marriage, then divorce. The prenup won't matter if we can prove she abandoned the child. I get custody, I get access to Thornfield money for child support. It's a long game, but the returns justify the investment. The recording cut to a different conversation, Garrett speaking with his lawyer about strategy. Find me precedent where the husband gets more than 50% because the wife's family is rich. There's got to be a way to argue the child deserves access to the Thornfield fortune, and I'm the responsible parent ensuring proper stewardship. Another clip, this one devastating in its casual cruelty. Garrett talking to Claudette, his voice edged with frustration. She's being difficult about the pregnancy. Keeps talking about how tired she is, how her back hurts. Like I care. This brat is just a golden ticket. Least she's good for something. Cassandra sat perfectly still, her face a mask, while the courtroom around her reacted with audible disgust. Gasps, murmurs, the scratch of pens as journalists transcribed quotes that would make headlines within the hour. Garrett had gone pale, his hands clenched on the defense table, the reality of his own voice destroying any possibility of denying intent. The prosecution continued methodically building their case, brick by brick. Financial records showing offshore accounts, tax returns with creative accounting that crossed from aggressive to fraudulent communications with Claudette, demonstrating conspiracy to isolate and manipulate. Then Claudette herself took the stand. She dressed carefully for the role of reformed accomplice, conservative suit. Minimal makeup, hair pulled back, suggesting professional competence rather than the sultry executive assistant persona she'd cultivated for Garrett's benefit. Her testimony was clinical, detailed, devastating. She described how Garrett had recruited her specifically for her willingness to participate in morally questionable activities, offering bonuses tied to successful manipulation of Cassandra's social connections. She provided emails where Garrett outlined specific strategies, discouraging friendships, monitoring phone calls, ensuring Cassandra remained dependent and isolated. The defense attorney, outmatched and underprepared, attempted cross-examination that went nowhere. Claudette had immunity and documentation, delivering both with the efficiency of someone who'd already accepted her role as villain seeking redemption through cooperation. The prosecution rested their case by mid-afternoon. The defense called no witnesses, offered no rebuttal beyond a closing statement that amounted to begging for mercy based on Garrett's previously clean record and supposed rehabilitation potential. The judge called a brief recess before victim impact statements, and Cassandra escaped to the hallway, needing air and space in 5 minutes where she wasn't performing strength for public consumption. Benedict found her standing by a window overlooking Foley Square, watching pedestrians navigate their ordinary Tuesday, while she navigated the surreal experience of watching her abuser face consequences. His voice was gentle, carefully neutral. "You don't have to read the statement. The evidence speaks for itself. The judge will sentence appropriately regardless." "I need to, not for him, for me. I need to stand up and say out loud what he did, claim it as my story instead of letting it be just evidence exhibits and legal arguments." "Then I'll be right there when you do." When court reconvened, the judge addressed Cassandra directly. "Mrs. Sullivan, I understand you've prepared a statement. Would you like to read it now?" Cassandra stood her legs steady despite adrenaline flooding her system. She walked to the podium reserved for victim statements, unfolded the paper she'd rewritten 17 times, and began to read. "Your Honor, my name is Cassandra Elizabeth Thornfield Sullivan, and I want to explain what it feels like to be hunted by someone who convinces you they're your savior." Her voice held steady, clear, and calm, each word chosen for precision rather than emotion. "I met Garrett Sullivan when I was 24 years old, trying to build a life independent of my family's wealth. I wanted to know if anyone could love me for who I was, rather than what I had. Garrett saw that vulnerability and weaponized it. He hired investigators to stalk me for 3 months, studied my routines, engineered a meeting designed to make him look heroic, then spent 6 months performing the role of someone who valued me as a person." She paused, glanced at Garrett, then returned her attention to the judge. "The cruelty didn't start immediately. It came slowly, subtle shifts I excused as adjustment to married life. He isolated me from friends. He controlled my access to money, giving me an allowance like I was a child rather than his partner. He criticized my appearance, my intelligence, my worth as a human being, conditioning me to believe I was lucky he tolerated my existence." The courtroom was silent, everyone leaning forward, caught by the quiet intensity of her delivery. "When I became pregnant, his abuse intensified. He called our daughter a burden, a golden ticket, a tool to access my family's money through custody manipulation. He conspired with his mistress to ensure I had no support system, no witnesses to contradict whatever narrative he planned to construct about my mental stability. He was going to take my child and use her as leverage to extort my family." Cassandra's hands tightened on the podium, the only visible sign of rage burning beneath her controlled exterior. "I want the court to understand that Garrett Sullivan didn't just commit financial fraud. He committed a violation of trust so profound that I spent 2 years questioning my own judgment, my own worth, my own ability to distinguish love from manipulation. He made me doubt everything about myself except my determination to protect my daughter from ever knowing him." She folded the paper, looked directly at Garrett, and delivered the final lines from memory. "You hunted me because you thought kindness was weakness. You were wrong. Kindness is the strongest thing I have, and I'm using it now to build something you'll never understand. A life where my daughter learns that her worth isn't measured in dollars, and that the right person will love her for her heart, not her inheritance. You taught me what evil looks like when it smiles. I'm teaching her what strength looks like when it chooses grace over vengeance." She returned to her seat, her brother's hands finding hers simultaneously, an anchor of familial support, reminding her she was no longer alone. The judge's expression had shifted from professional neutrality to barely concealed anger. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many men use legal systems to terrorize women. "Mr. Sullivan, please stand." Garrett rose, his lawyer beside him, both knowing what came next but required to perform the ritual anyway. "I've reviewed the evidence, heard testimony, and read Mrs. Sullivan's statement. What you did represents a particularly calculated form of abuse, using institutions of marriage and parenthood as weapons to extract wealth through manipulation of someone's natural desire to be loved. You showed no remorse, no recognition of harm, no understanding that your victim was a human being rather than a financial opportunity." The judge consulted her notes, though Cassandra suspected she'd already decided the sentence before entering the courtroom. "On the charge of marriage fraud, I sentence you to 2 years in federal prison. On the charge of tax evasion, 3 years. On securities violations, 2 years. On conspiracy to commit fraud, 3 years. These sentences will run consecutively, not concurrently, for a total of 10 years in federal prison." 10 years. The number landed like a physical blow. Garrett swayed, gripped the table for support. The judge continued, relentless. "Additionally, you are ordered to pay $20 million in restitution to Cassandra Thornfield, this amount representing compensation for emotional distress, economic losses, and punitive damages. Your parental rights to Victoria Grace Thornfield are permanently terminated. You are forbidden from any contact with the child or her mother for the duration of your natural life." She brought down the gavel, the sound echoing through the silent courtroom like a gunshot. "Bailiff, remand the defendant to custody." Garrett tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing, words failing to form coherent sentences. The bailiff approached with handcuffs, and Garrett's survival instinct finally kicked in. He turned toward Cassandra, desperation making him reckless. "Please, Cassandra, please. I know I don't deserve it, but let me see her, just once. Victoria, she's my daughter. I have some right." Cassandra stood, her brothers rising with her like a coordinated threat display. She walked forward until she stood directly in front of Garrett, close enough to see the fear in his eyes, the reality of consequences finally penetrating his narcissistic certainty. Her voice was quiet, forcing him to lean forward to hear, making the moment intimate in a way that violated his remaining dignity. "You are a biological contributor. Victoria has 3 fathers, her uncles who were there when she was born, who hold her when she cries, who will teach her that love means protection, not predation. You are nothing to her, a stranger who tried to buy access to her life through manipulation and fraud. You failed." She stepped back, turned away, walked toward the exit with her head high. Behind her, Garrett made some sound protest or plea, but she didn't turn around. His voice no longer had power over her. The media ambush outside the courthouse was expected but still overwhelming. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, questions shouted over each other in cacophony. Nathaniel and Dominic formed a protective barrier, Benedict running interference with legal threats that made reporters step back. Someone managed to get close enough to shout a question directly at Cassandra. "Do you feel justice was served? Was 10 years enough?" She paused, considered not answering, then decided the statement mattered beyond just this moment. "Justice isn't measured in years. It's measured in the safety of my daughter and the knowledge that other women might see this case and understand they don't have to endure abuse alone. If this story helps one person leave a situation like mine, then yes, justice was served." The quote would make every headline, but Cassandra didn't wait to see the response. She climbed into the SUV, let Dominic navigate through the crowd, closed her eyes and breathed through the adrenaline crash that left her shaking. "You did good." Nathaniel's voice came from the front seat, gruff with emotion he wouldn't show on his face. "Dad would have been proud." Victoria was awake when they returned to the estate, making fussy sounds that meant she was hungry and unimpressed by delays. Mrs. Chen handed her over with the knowing smile of someone who understood that sometimes a mother needed the simple act of feeding her child to remember why fighting mattered. Cassandra settled into the rocking chair in the nursery, guided Victoria to latch, felt the letdown reflex as her body responded to her daughter's need. This was the opposite of everything Garrett had made her feel: useful, necessary, powerful in the most fundamental way. She rocked slowly, watching Victoria's eyes drift closed as she fed this perfect small human who would grow up never knowing the man who'd planned to use her as a weapon. Benedict knocked softly on the doorframe. "Sorry to interrupt, but we should discuss next steps while they're still time-sensitive." "Can't it wait?" "Some of it, yes, but the media situation is escalating. Everyone wants your story. Major outlets, book publishers, podcast producers. We need to control the narrative before others speak for you and get details wrong." Cassandra considered this while Victoria finished feeding, burped against her shoulder, settled into milk-drunk sleep. She handed the baby to Benedict, who accepted her with surprising competence for someone who'd never changed a diaper before becoming an uncle. "One interview. Print, not video. Somewhere respectable that won't turn my trauma into clickbait. And any profits go into a foundation." "What kind of foundation?" The idea had been forming for months, crystallizing during therapy sessions where her counselor pointed out that victimhood didn't have to be an identity, that survival could transform into advocacy. Legal aid for women escaping fraudulent marriages, therapy funding for abuse survivors, safe housing for mothers fleeing situations where children are being used as leverage. Call it the Grace Foundation after Victoria's middle name. Benedict smiled, already calculating tax implications and organizational structures. "I'll have incorporation papers ready by morning." "How much initial funding?" $50 million to start. We'll reassess based on need and impact." Nathaniel, who'd been listening from the hallway, stepped into the nursery. "That's a significant commitment. Are you sure you're ready for that responsibility while Victoria's still this young?" "I'm ready to build something that matters. Garrett took 2 years of my life. I'm not giving him any more time by hiding. I'm going to use what happened to help others escape before they lose as much as I did." The interview with the New Yorker happened 2 weeks later. 3 hours of detailed testimony about hiding her identity, the systematic abuse, the recording that captured Garrett, calling their unborn child a golden ticket. The article ran 6 weeks later. 12,000 words, somehow capturing the complexity of choosing vulnerability in a world that punished it. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of women reached out through the Foundation's hotline, sharing stories of manipulation disguised as romance partners who'd isolated them from support systems, children weaponized in custody battles designed to maintain control. Cassandra read every letter, funded every legitimate request for legal assistance or housing support, built systems to help women escape situations she recognized from her own nightmare. 18 months after the trial, the Grace Foundation was hosting its first anniversary gala at the Plaza Hotel. Cassandra stood backstage in a simple black dress, waiting for her introduction, reviewing notes for a speech she'd written and rewritten until the words felt true. The ballroom was full, 500 attendees who'd paid $10,000 per plate donations that would fund operations for another year. Board members, philanthropists, survivors who'd rebuilt their lives with the Foundation's help. When her name was announced, Cassandra walked onto the stage to applause that felt genuine rather than obligatory. She gripped the podium, looked out at faces illuminated by candlelight, and began to speak. 18 months ago, I stood in a different courtroom and told a judge what it felt like to be hunted by someone who convinced me he was my savior. Today, I want to tell you what it feels like to transform that pain into purpose." She detailed the Foundation's work. 347 women helped escape abusive situations, $2 million in settlements secured from fraudulent partners, legal precedent established in New York Family Court for considering economic abuse in custody determinations. Every woman who walks through our doors teaches me something new about resilience. They remind me that survival isn't passive, it's the most active, courageous thing we do. And when we choose to help others survive, we transform our wounds into wisdom. The applause when she finished was thunderous, but Cassandra barely heard it. She was already thinking about the next phase expansion into other states' partnerships with existing domestic violence organizations, building something that would outlast her and protect women who hadn't even been born yet. In a federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania, Garrett Sullivan sat in the common area watching the gala coverage on a television bolted to the wall. The news anchor narrated footage of Cassandra accepting an award, elegant and confident, speaking about the foundation's impact with the authority of someone who'd earned her platform through suffering. His cellmate, a tax evader named Morrison, serving 7 years for offshore account fraud, shook his head with something between pity and contempt. "Man, I heard you had the world in your hands and crushed it yourself." Garrett wanted to defend himself, to explain that he'd been smart and strategic and had almost pulled it off. But the words died in his throat because even he couldn't believe them anymore. On screen, Cassandra was answering a reporter's question about what she'd say to other survivors. Her response was immediate, unflinching. "You are not defined by what was done to you. You are defined by what you choose to do next. And if you choose to help others, you discover that kindness isn't weakness, it's the most powerful force in the world." The broadcast cut to commercial, and Morrison stood to leave, pausing to look down at Garrett with something like sympathy. "That woman's going to change thousands of lives, and you're going to spend the next 8 years watching her do it from in here. That's got to hurt worse than the sentence." Garrett turned away from the television, from the image of Cassandra surrounded by people who respected rather than feared her, and understood with terrible clarity that this was his life now. 10 years of watching from prison as she built something meaningful from ruins he'd created, every accomplishment a reminder of everything he'd destroyed through his own greed and cruelty. The worst part wasn't the loss of freedom or money or status. It was knowing he'd held something precious and chosen to break it rather than cherish it, that every decision leading to this moment had been his own, that he couldn't claim the comfort of being a victim of circumstances. He was just a man who'd seen kindness and mistaken it for weakness, who'd weaponized love without understanding what love actually meant. That same night, Cassandra returned to the Hamptons estate after the gala, exhausted but satisfied. The event had raised $3 million, enough to open 2 new safe houses and expand legal services into Connecticut and New Jersey. Victoria was asleep in her crib, 22 months old now, dark curls spread across her pillow. Cassandra stood in the doorway, watching her daughter's chest rise and fall with the easy rhythm of someone who'd never known fear, who'd grown up surrounded by uncles who treated her like royalty, and a mother who would burn the world down before letting anyone hurt her. She touched the silver locket around her neck, the one Dominic had given her with photographs of her parents. Her father had worried that the world would try to harden her kindness. Instead, she'd learned to weaponize it, to transform softness into strength without losing the essential quality that made her who she was. Cassandra walked to her bedroom window overlooking the dark Atlantic. The waves were invisible in the darkness, but she could hear them, steady and relentless, reshaping the shore through persistence rather than force. She thought about the woman she'd been 3 years ago, desperate to prove she could exist without her family's protection, naive enough to believe that hiding from privilege would help her find authentic connection. That woman had been hunted, trapped, systematically destroyed by someone who saw vulnerability as opportunity. But that woman had also survived, had documented abuse with meticulous care, had protected her unborn child with fierce determination, had found strength to face her abuser in court and reclaim her story. Cassandra whispered into the darkness, her breath fogging the window glass. "I understand now. Kindness isn't weakness. It's the hardest, bravest thing we do. And when we choose to extend it to others who are suffering, we discover that the strongest thing we can build is a bridge between pain and purpose." The ocean answered with waves that had been reshaping shorelines long before she was born, and would continue long after she was gone, patient and persistent proof that even the hardest stone eventually yields to water that refuses to stop pushing forward. She stood there for a long time, listening to the rhythm of waves and breathing, feeling the weight of the locket against her skin, thinking about the 347 women who'd walked through the foundation's doors and the thousands more who would come after. Garrett had tried to break her by making her believe she was worthless without him. Instead, he'd taught her that her worth was infinite precisely because it didn't depend on anyone's validation. She'd survived his cruelty and transformed it into compassion for others, turned her wounds into wisdom, built something that would protect women long after she was gone. That was the victory that mattered, not the courtroom verdict or the 10-year sentence or even the $20 million in restitution. The real victory was standing here whole and purposeful, looking at a future she'd built from the ruins of what someone else had tried to destroy. She touched the window glass one more time, then turned away from the ocean and walked back to Victoria's room. She stood over her daughter's crib, watching her sleep, and made a silent promise. You will grow up knowing that kindness is strength, that your worth has nothing to do with your last name or your trust fund, that the right person will love you for your heart, not your inheritance. And if anyone ever tries to make you small, you'll have 3 uncles and a mother who will remind you exactly how vast you are. Cassandra adjusted Victoria's blanket, kissed her forehead, and walked out of the nursery toward her own bedroom. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: foundation board meetings, interviews with women seeking help, the endless work of building systems that protected the vulnerable. But tonight she let herself feel peace. Hard-won, fragile, but real. The kind of peace that comes from knowing the worst happened, and you endured, that your daughter would grow up safe and loved, that your pain had purpose. She climbed into bed, pulled the covers up, and closed her eyes. Outside, the waves continued their patient work, reshaping stone into sand, proving that persistence always wins in the end.